And we move on now to welcome and introduce Robert Gilman, who's here with us today as a long-time companion on the road. He's been a part of the movement since, at least his journey, as he says himself, started back in 1979, so it's really been a long time. He's one of the thinkers, the deep thinkers. Actually, before he started working for change on this planet, he worked as an astrophysicist. So he was busy with the stars out there and how do they move, and then at some point he thought about how can we get the stars to start moving on this planet? Because we need the light now, we need it here. And he founded the Context Institute in 1979, an institute that is actually being revived right at this moment. He very deeply shaped and defined the eco-village networks, the global eco-village networks from its inception, created a clear definition of eco-villages that is still with us. And he went on to explore both the global way in which we can instigate change, but then also going back to research how can we work more on local and regional levels to really start change happening. And at the moment, I think there's a turning point where he's bringing his experience from that back to the global levels. One of the clear messages that he brings is the way that we're living at the moment is not sustainable. We need to change. And the other message is we are changing and it's possible. It is possible to have sustainable societies. So it's a message of hope, and the Context Institute is working with stepping stones towards that change that we need.
I also just wanted to publicly acknowledge on behalf of this community the gifts that Robert has brought us over the years, because about 15 years ago, Robert is a Findhorn fellow, as some of you are actually, a body of people, illustrious people that we wish to stay in good relationship with. And Robert actually volunteered quite a lot of his time about 15 years ago, about 6 months he was here, to help us birth the most successful incarnation of a governance structure for this whole community, the new Findhorn Association. He was very generous with his time and his skills and his experience researching and helping us birth this, and is willing to stay another week, this time also to continue to work with us around the evolution of our governance structures. So not only a man of intellect and vision, but also great generosity. And thank you very much for that on behalf of this community. And a huge welcome to you. And let's welcome Dr. Robert Gilman.
Thank you. It's a delight to be back here. And Graham was talking about being moved. I'm very moved to just be standing here. And thank you, Graham, for inviting me to present to this ICSA conference. I'm very touched to be here. And I have something that I'm really excited to share with you. I need to warn you up front that it's something with a number of different pieces to it. I want to be able to connect some dots, but I've got to communicate what those dots are to begin with. But I had the confidence that this was a high-capacity crowd. So I think we'll be able to do all right with it. I am cognizant that a number of people in the audience, English is not your first language. And so I will try to speak in a way that will be intelligible. I also have more text in the slides than I might do if I were just speaking to a group of fellow Americans. So for those of you who are into the fine points of how to do presentations, understand that the reason that I have more text up there is so that those who don't have English as a first language, and then the other reason is that it helps me remember what it was that I meant to say. So anyway, let's get into this. I'd like to start off with just a little preview, which is to say, this is sort of the summation of the talk, if you will, that I've never been more encouraged about the future than I am today. And I hope that by the end of this talk you'll understand why I'm feeling that way. Okay, let's get into it. The major focus of this talk is going to be looking at where are we in history. What is it that's going on right now? Where are we? What's the future? I'm not going to be able to predict the future for you, but what's the momentum of the times? Where have we come from? So it's going to be a look at where we are in history, and of course for this conference, particular emphasis on what are the implications for intentional communities. But before even getting into that, I'd like to start with a piece that deals with a certain characteristic of systems that I haven't found a lot of literature about, but I've increasingly felt is one of those really important things to understand about systems that I'm describing as system domains. Okay, so what is a system domain? A system domain is something that grows out of the relationship between a system and its context. I'm going to give you a kind of verbal description, but then I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. And this is most easily understood through the examples. So just don't worry too much about this verbal description. A system domain is a region in the relationship between system and context where the system has a characteristic set of behaviors. And the behavior of the system can change dramatically when you move from one domain to another domain. Okay, so let's have an example that I think will help you get this a little better. Let's look at H2O, which we're most familiar with as a liquid. But if you get the temperature above boiling, of course, it becomes a gas. And the behavior of a liquid and the behavior of a gas are quite different. Go down below freezing, it becomes a solid. Again, a very different set of behaviors. Anywhere from just above freezing to just below boiling, it's a liquid. It has a similar set of behaviors all in that territory. And then you cross a very narrow transition and it moves into a very different set of behaviors. Sharp transition between those domains. All right, next example is going to be with something most of us experience, home heating. And there's a house. Sometimes it's warm and sunny. Sometimes it's stormy and cold. And because of that, and because we'd like to have a more uniform experience for ourselves, we put in heating systems. And so this has got a little thermostat here and a little heater. So we're going to treat the house and the thermostat and all of this as the system that we're going to be talking about. And the inside temperature is going to be the key characteristic that we'll track. And then we're going to treat the outside weather and the outside temperature as the context and see what's the relationship between the system, inside temperature, and its context in terms of outside temperature. Well, over a wide span of outside temperature, hopefully the inside temperature stays constant. That's, after all, why we have the heating system. But if you get up above where the thermostat is set and the outside temperature goes above that, then the inside temperature is going to go up also. And if you get cold enough, you'll get to a point where your heating system is going full time and yet it's still not keeping up. And so the temperature inside the house will begin to go down. Don't worry too much about the formulas. That's not the point here. Although the point is that you've got three different formulas. So we've got three different domains. In the center, what I'm calling domain JR for just right. This is a sort of Goldilocks story. The heater goes on and off and the temperature stays constant. That's the set of behaviors in that center domain. Up there in domain H for hot, the heater is off and the temperature goes up. And then down here in domain C for cold, the heater is on, but it's not able to keep the temperature from from dropping. So 3 separate domains in which the description of the behavior stays the same within the domain, but between domains it changes dramatically. All right, third example, ecosystem. We're going to look at a forest. The context will be the resources that the forest draws on. And we're going to start with bare ground and watch how the forest develops over time. So we're going to start with something like that. And if we do that and look at how much biomass develops over time, we'll find that we get a curve that initially looks like this. It accelerated growth. But if we keep watching it, that curve decelerates, changes its shape, and eventually you get something that looks like this. This is old growth forest. That's the whole river rainforest out in my part of the world, by the way. So what we have here is something that's called an S-curve, and it's a very common curve to show up in biological systems or any system in which you have some kind of reproductive growth that depends upon resources. And the reason that the curve is turning over is because there's something known as the carrying capacity, a certain limit that you can't grow too much beyond, although I do want to acknowledge that a lot of times you actually can overshoot that, and depending upon what happens with the overshoot, you go into either a deep collapse or kind of an oscillation. But I just want to acknowledge that you can get overshoot and collapse as well as the smooth S-curve. But the S-curve will serve our purposes for now. Within this, you've got a midpoint on that S-curve. Below the midpoint, it's reproduction limited. That is, the growth is growing as fast as things can reproduce because there's lots of resources for the number of plants that are available. But once you get above that midpoint, it's resource limited. So we've got 2 domains, but here the transition between them is much more gradual. In the reproduction limited domain, I also want to describe that you wind up with 2 different sets of species predominating in these 2 different domains. In the reproduction limited domain, you get what are called pioneer species. And in the resource limited domain, you get succession species. And this distinction between pioneer species and succession species serves as a wonderful analogy for understanding a bunch of things that are going on in human society at this point. So I just want to point to the success strategies of the 2 different groups, the pioneers and the succession species. And they're kind of mirror images of each other. I'm not going to go down this whole list. I'll just say that the top 4 are pretty obvious in terms of what you would get if the distinction depends upon how many resources you have. But the bottom group isn't quite so intuitively obvious. And I want to point particularly to this set over here. The succession species have high diversity. There are a lot of different succession species. The individual species tend to be relatively complex. And their relationship with each other is cooperative. There's a lot of symbiosis that goes on within succession species. Okay, so just to summarize this system domain stuff, it's created by the relationship between the system and its context. Sometimes it's because the system is changing, sometimes it's because the context is changing. The transitions between the domains can either be sharp or gradual, like water was, or gradual like the ecosystem was. System behavior changes across the transition. If you know only one domain, if we know only one domain, we can be misled into thinking we understand the system. And a great example of this is what happened with Newtonian physicists around 1900, when quantum mechanics and special relativity started coming in, and the Newtonian physicists said, hey, wait a minute, we understand the world, it's all Newtonian. Well, the problem was that the domain that Newtonian physics works in, you have to have relatively slow speeds, that is, slower than the speed of light, and you can't be dealing with anything that's as small as atoms. When you're dealing in that domain, Newtonian physics still works really well. But we as humans get caught up all the time in discovering a certain domain of understanding. We extrapolate that it is the total understanding, and then we get really shocked when we discover the edge of the domain. So because of that, identifying a system's domains and transitions is critical to fully understanding the system. And this is where we're going to take the point to history. Okay, so that was system domains. Now let's start looking at where we are in history. I want to start with a brief look at the last century or so, and then step back further. Kasia mentioned that I have a background as an astrophysicist. You know, I'm accustomed to looking at things in terms of billions of years. I mean, 16,000 years, I almost get a headache from shrinking down that small, but that's what we'll do. And then from that sense of deep history, we're going to move forward to be able to look at the 21st century and where things are headed. Okay, so the last century or so. And here I want to focus on world population. Population is a wonderful sort of aggregate indicator for what's happening to the average person and not just the people who show up in history books. Starting in 1900 up to, that's 2010 or so, increase of population that, what is it? I think it's 4.2 times, huge increase in population in the last century or so. However, if you do a little curve fitting, there's the S-curve that fits through that. It's not an exponential growth. It only looks exponential down here at the beginning. And the midpoint on that comes at about 1990. We're a little over 20 years past the midpoint in that curve. And if we make the analogy with the pioneer and succession species, then indeed, up until 1990 or so, pioneer-type strategies should have been the thing that the context was supporting. But we've now moved into a new domain. But because we're humans, we don't realize it yet. Going forward, it will be the succession species strategies that will have the support of the context that we're in. All right, well, someone might object and say, oh yeah, curve fitting, easy. But what is there around us that suggests that we really have moved from a time that wasn't resource constrained into a time that is resource constrained? So one of my favorite indicators of what's going on at that level is the global ecological footprint. How many of you are familiar with the ecological footprint? So I see some hands going up, others not. Let me just say that this is a measure of how much human activity is filling the biocapacity, the ecological capacity of the world. And this goes back to 1900, 1950, 2000. This goes up to 2008, which is the last data that they have. And I would just point out that more than half of this is from CO2 from fossil fuels. If we were, here I ought to actually step back and say, we're now at a point where we're using 1.5 Earths. And you could say, how in the heck could we be using 1.5 Earths? Well, this is a measure of what the sustainability requirements are. we're over our sustainability requirements. We're effectively over our carrying capacity. But because the atmosphere is absorbing the CO2 and the effects won't come through for a while, that's how we can do it. There's nothing hard fixed about saying that a certain population must have this kind of footprint. If we were getting our energy from renewable energy sources, for instance, and not from burning fossil fuels, then all of this would go away. If we were being more efficient in the way we were using land for getting food, fiber, and timber, then this would be smaller. So this isn't a strict, hard sentence, as it were. We actually have a fair bit of choice in this, but this reflects business as usual. This reflects how we're currently functioning. And this is an example of, or an indicator of what I would more broadly describe as the limits to growth crisis, which comes out of the fact that we're dependent on a number of resources that are themselves finite in one way or another. They're non-renewable resources, fossil fuels and others, renewable resources that have maximum sustainable yields, like fisheries, where we're overfishing, and natural waste processing services, the estuaries that clean up water and are the planet's ability to absorb carbon dioxide. Well, in all these cases, we've overshot, but the time lags have been delaying the full impact. But this is part of, this is a huge crisis that we all will need to deal with one way or another. I also want to say that as far as I'm concerned, the issues here are not primarily technological. I like to say there are no environmental problems. There are only environmental symptoms of human problems. This doesn't... This doesn't reflect what we could do. This reflects the choices that have been made. Okay, so pulling this back together, there's that carrying capacity which we crossed in 1970 when we had a population that was a little bit below 4 billion. And because it sure looks like we're in overshoot, in terms of how that curve extends forward, this curve that's just a simple S-curve fit, more realistic estimates of where the world population is going. This is, I'm going to give you something here that is taken from Jorgen Randers in his book 2052. Jorgen Randers was one of the 3 authors of the original Limits to Growth study in 1972. So this peaks in 2040 at a population of about 8.1 billion. We're at this point about 1 billion away from that peak, and I want to point out how different it will be to be in a time when we're not only at the peak but before long heading down, compared with the 20th century experience of such explosive growth. This will have huge impacts on all kinds of different things. Number one being the economy, because we've built an economic system that presumes unending growth. And when you don't have unending growth, things change. Okay, let's step back. And again, I want to look at population. So here's going to be the population from, oh, by the way, historical, dating has all sorts of interesting, weird stuff with it. This is before current era. Also, it's the same thing as BC, for those of you who are more familiar with that. And I've used minus signs because, frankly, it's easier to plot that way. There's a 1 here instead of a 0 because apparently there is no year 0. It's 1 AD and 1 BC is the same year. Anyway. This was an academic group. I thought I'd probably do it right. So, and what I want to show you is this is data from the US Census where they've gathered together the best estimates for this over this stretch, and that's what the population curve looks like. It's kind of interesting. To give you some points of reference here, this is where farming starts. This is the first cities. This is where Rome was at its height, and this is the Renaissance. And there's that carrying capacity. Okay. I've worked with this in terms of what I like to describe as an outline of history, in which I have 3 cultural system domains. This is why I had to introduce the system domains to you, so that we could look at history in terms of these domains and 2 cultural system transitions between them. I described the 3 domains as tribal, empire, and planetary. Those are the terms that I use for them. I'm not the only one who uses those terms. Other people use different terms, but that's what we'll use in this talk anyway. The first transition starts with farming and ends with cities. The second transition starts with the Renaissance, and it probably hasn't ended yet. We're still in it. And I can't tell you how much longer we're going to go with it, but I think we're more than halfway through. Let me put it that way. And I think the next 20 to 40 years are going to be hugely consequential in terms of how this second great transition plays itself out. This is something I've been playing with for a while. I went back and dug out the first time that I published a chart of this kind, and you can see that was back before I decided to call the third era Planetary. This is from 1985. But this overall outline isn't what I grew up with. I grew up with this sense that there was history, which began when writing began, and before that was something called prehistory. That's what I learned in school. And my sense is that that's actually what most people in the mainstream carry around in their heads. That we're all just, what's happening now is all just part of one continuous flow of history. Of course, here, especially here at Findhorn, I would want to acknowledge that there have also been people who have said, that we are at a significant turning point. And in one way or another have described that we're moving into some sort of new age of some form or another. The Joanna Macy's Great Turning is an example of focusing on this point. Historians have also looked at this, and I want to draw on the work of David Christian, Introduction to Big History, where he breaks up this timeline in terms of Paleolithic, agrarian, and modern. That's his set of terms. And then he also says, though, however, that breakup isn't good enough. We have to add a second dimension of breakup in terms of kinship-based and state-based. So he has a split agrarian. Let's see. And if you put lines in here, you'll see that this upper outline of history lines up pretty nicely with all the breakpoints that are here. And it's not just because of what I've chosen here. I would say that these breakpoints of farming, cities, Renaissance, and wherever we are now are pretty common breakpoints when people are trying to get a big overview on history. I'm going to focus in on 3 characteristics. Remember, when we were looking at the house heating, we just had temperature. Well, this is a little more complicated because it's culture. I'm going to look at main livelihood, the basis for social organization, and the communication level of development, something I also would call the communications state of the art. In the tribal era, the main livelihood is hunting and gathering, the basis for social organization is kinship, and the communications level of development is orality. Stories, song, verse, etc. And those characteristics are consistent throughout the tribal period. In the Empire period, the main livelihood is agriculture. The basis for social organization is violence-enforced, religiously sanctioned hierarchy. And some of you may not like my expression that way, but for me that's just the bald truth. And then the communications level of development was elite literacy. In the planetary era, well, we don't know yet. That's the whole point. We're trying to sort out what those characteristics might be like in the planetary era. So how are we going to do that? How shall we discern the future? First of all, we need to recognize that humanity doesn't have a terribly good track record in terms of being able to discern the future. So we need to approach this, first of all, with a certain amount of humility, and secondly, with a willingness to take a fresh approach to trying to discern the future. It's hard to imagine beyond your own domain. Think, for example, if you were part of a hunting and gathering band back 20,000 years ago, and you had this thought that came into your mind of cities and writing and all of that, it would be very hard for you to understand those things. It's just totally out of your experience. In the same way, think of somebody in 1500. You might recognize her. Trying to understand what our life was like today. It would just be bizarre. So, as we try and think about what may be coming, we need to do it with a recognition that it's a challenge. So we need some kind of strategy that's going to help us to look across the empire to planetary transition. And the strategy that I'm going to be using and sharing with you is to, first of all, look for analogies in nature. That's where the pioneer and succession come in. And also to explore deep history from the perspective of cultural system domains in search of essential patterns that transcend any one domain. Part of our problem here in trying to do this is that we are so immersed in the mentality of the Empire era that we don't see it. It's the water we swim in. And so we've got to find a way to step out of that water far enough to be able to look into our potential future. Okay, so we're going to proceed by looking first at the first great transition, then look a little bit at the Empire era, and out of this, hopefully get a sense of how to approach our current transition. And in terms of what we can learn from our current transition, hopefully that will then give us a sense of where we're headed in the planetary era. Okay, so the first transition. What's going on as we move from one to the other? And let's start with focusing on the change of main livelihood from hunting and gathering to agriculture. This happened in what gets described as the lucky latitudes. It happened first in the area of the Middle East it's called the hilly flanks. Happened around 11,000 BCE. And then later happened in China, what's now China, and in Middle America around 8,000 BCE. Okay, so why agriculture? Why did it appear there? What's going on? And it seems as though the key trigger was climate change coming out of the last ice age. This is from ice cores, sort of a proxy for changes in global temperature. And you see this spike that comes up here and then it goes back down again. There was a lot of local variation, so the relative proportion between these two you may not need to take that too seriously. But what shows up is that at this spike, we start seeing settlements. In most of the tribal period, people lived in a nomadic way. And especially during the Ice Age, things were not that abundant, and you had to keep moving. Well, this is sometimes described, this peak as things warm up, is sometimes described as the golden age of hunting and gathering, when there was such an abundance relative to the human population that people were actually able to stay in settlements. And some of the ones who stayed in settlements started checking out the local food sources and started working with them. But then the temperature started going down again. Most groups just went nomadic again, but in the hilly flanks area, one of the things that they did was to domesticate grains. And you start seeing in the archaeological record domesticated grains down in the dip of that little bit of repeat of the cold period. And it wasn't until things warmed up again that you get the grains in China and the Americas. So in this sense, we have a change within the human cultural system that's driven by the outside influence of the end of the Ice Age. But once it got going, it sets off a really powerful dynamic. Settlements and farming go very much together. They encourage each other, they depend on each other. And once you get that started, farming actually allows you to capture more energy per person and per area, per hectare. That, combined with the characteristics of settlements, the fact that the women who were going to be bearing children weren't walking all the time, led to population growth, quite significant population growth. These together allowed not only population growth, but higher population density. That's what happens in a settlement. Well, with a higher population density and the higher population, you overexploited all of the animals and gatherable plants around you. So you became more and more dependent upon what you'd actually domesticated. In that process, you lost the skills that were required for hunting and gathering. And all of this, the overexploitation, the de-skilling, and the higher population density, meant that once you got past a certain threshold of population growth, you really couldn't turn back to hunting and gathering. It was an irreversible transition. All right, now let's look at the basis for social organization, moving from kinship to the violence-enforced, religiously sanctioned hierarchy. And I'm going to be drawing on the work of Ian Morris here, another historian, particularly his Social Development Index and the components for that. This is, out of his work, a look at the size of the largest settlements as we move along in time. This is going from 12,000 BCE to 2000 BCE, or the start of farming up to the first cities. And as we move along this, when we're down here, especially settlements that are below 500 and even below 1,000, you're in a range where the brain is able to know that group of people. You can know them in a way in which you have a personal sense of them. And because of the history, it's very much a kinship-based knowing. But once you start getting larger settlements, you can't personally know the 2,000 or 3,000 people in the same kind of way. And so things morph. The kinship system morphs into something that's much more dependent upon clans and knowing people through clans. And what the archaeological record shows that as you move up in size, the clans begin to differentiate themselves, and they become more hierarchical in terms of what goes in the burials and other things of this sort. There's also an important dynamic here that comes out of energy capture. And so this is, again, how much energy is being captured per person. It gradually increases between farming and the first cities. Up here it's 2.2 times what it was down here at the start of farming. So that's actually a big increase in the amount of useful energy, the kilocalories per day that you're gathering per person, and it opens up all kinds of fresh opportunities. So when you have more energy captured per person, it allows more division of labor, because not everybody has to be working on all the time on gathering food. You also create a situation with farming where you've got storable and stealable surplus. And this is hugely important. These two, or the more storable and stealable surplus, mean you've got more motivation for raids. More division of labor, more motivation for raids, you get better weapons and fighters. And that all shows up in the archaeological record. More violent intergroup conflict, and more militarization of the communities. As time goes on, you go initially from communities that had no fortifications to eventually communities with lots of fortifications. So, empire-era hierarchy. There are lots of different ways. I'm only listing a few here, but adults over children, men over women, powerful men and women over others, humans over nature, mind and spirit over the body, sky gods over everything. And this legacy is still very powerful, still very powerfully with us today. Okay, let's just look at the transition to literacy. It begins with numbers, actually, before there's much in the way of real transcription of spoken language. A lot of it focuses on accounting and record keeping. And you had to have enough people close enough together to have enough scribes to make it worth it to write things down. If you were the only scribe in town, I mean, you wouldn't be. You know, it's one of those things like you never have just only one lawyer in a town. You have to have two so that they... Never mind. So it emerges with the first cities. And it's really important for the development of the empire period because it's the complement to military force. But before that, you could go out and you could raid, you could do protection rackets, but you couldn't really manage the area that you had conquered. With writing, you now can manage it. So within this transition, there are a series of what you could call sub-transitions that sort of spread out over time. Before, you're in the tribal domain. It's pure tribal characteristics. At the end, you're in pure empire characteristics. But in the middle, it's a rolling transition. So what kind of lessons can we draw from this? First is that the driving forces were gradual and unobtrusive. Small changes could grow to irreversibility. Changes in one part of the system destabilized other parts. And it was powered by positive feedback loops that keep changing until a new constellation of qualities is found. Also, the initial set of qualities, the foraging, kinship, and orality, they never go away. They just become secondary. Okay, empire era. Quickly, as I've been saying, it's agriculture, hierarchy, literacy. I'll just point out that 90% or more of the population was involved as peasants or serfs or slaves or whatever in agriculture. And literacy, even in places like Athens, apparently never got above 10% or so. So it really was an elite phenomenon. You might have had, well, never mind. Enough of that. These three characteristics stay stable for at least 4,500 years. If you look at Egypt and you look at the Chinese empires in 1600, and all the various different civilizations in between, they have the same group of patterns. Nevertheless, there were some changes. This is what happens with largest settlements. Rome certainly figured out, all those Roman engineers figured out how to do sewage and things like that that enabled the settlement size to really grow. And then there were Chinese cities later that also grew up to about 1 million population. But there seemed to be some kind of ceiling that was very hard for agrarian civilization to go beyond. And this is population over that period of time. It kept growing as well. And I like to think particularly of the population, and then what I'm going to show you next, as kind of like when we thought about water, and liquid water kept the properties of liquid throughout, but you could raise the temperature as you moved up towards boiling. Well, I think of this population growth as kind of raising the temperature. The other thing that raised the temperature was that there were a number of really significant inventions that happened along the way. They didn't coalesce well enough to change the pattern, but they laid the groundwork for the second great transition. And let's look at that. A key factor that, to me, sets off the second great transition, or at least is a characteristic of it, there's a lot of debate about, why did it happen? But innovation gets to be seen, at least in some ways, as an asset. And that sets off a whole chain of activity that, again, creates a rolling transition. And by innovation, I don't just mean the technical stuff. Social innovations, economic innovations, all of that stuff. Anything that is a cultural change that lands. And of course, it's always been a factor in one way or another. But before the Empire era, it was really just too slow to even notice. So people could maintain the mythology that they were always following tradition. During the Empire era, elites were wary of transition. They occasionally encouraged it a little bit, but then stomped on it often pretty quickly. And they were probably right. It was a threat. History has shown that it was a threat. Europe wound up being best positioned to lead on innovation. There were multiple competing centers of power. So there wasn't one central authority that could just stomp it all out. In 1500, Europe was relatively backward, and they were just becoming aware that there were other places in the world that were more advanced than they were, and so they knew that they had places to learn from. They had a major initial success with warships. So in 1500, this is the high tech. And this was what allowed a small, at that point, culturally relatively backward country like Portugal to establish a global empire. The problem with this is that it was a global empire based on technological superiority, which is a hard thing to keep because other people can copy you unless you keep moving. So, what's the dynamic that happened? You had multiple centers of power and dependence on technological superiority. This led to a local arms race. The British wanted to do this too, and so did the Dutch, and so did the French and the Spanish, and so they got into battles with each other. That local arms race wound up accelerating Europe's advantage because they moved each other forward in that process of that arms race. But it also cost the various kings quite a bit, and they had to turn to the commercial sector and allow it more than had been allowed in the past. That was a dangerous thing to do. All this emphasis on boats benefited commerce, so power started spreading to the commercial elites. Commerce then expanded, and as commerce expanded, it drove still more innovation. Demand for literacy grew. That undercut the old knowledge authorities. Some of them didn't like it. There was this thing called the Inquisition, you know. I mean, I don't want to... but it did wind up meaning that the deference to the old elites got diminished. And then you had all of the upheavals, the Reformation, the French Revolution, etc. All got driven in this atmosphere. And it was a process that was and still is self-reinforcing. Okay, so with that as an important factor, what can we now start to say about this transition for these three characteristics? And I'm not going to try to say what's going to happen in the planetary era, but more if we treat the transition as this overlap between two eras, what can we say is showing up about the planetary era so far? So start with main livelihood. Here is the distribution of workforce in 1500, and the size of the circle is proportional to the world population at that point in time. So 90% of it is in agriculture. Here it is in 2007. Circle's much bigger, of course, because there are a lot more of us, but it's also a much more diverse distribution. Agriculture is not even the largest of the pie slices. So we've moved to a time when there is no more main occupation. And we have a huge diversity of occupations. And I'm going to suggest that in the planetary era, not only will we have diversity of occupations, we will have diversity in a great many ways, just as succession species are characterized by a high level of diversity. I'm going to jump down to communications next. So in the past 500 years, the whole communications arena has changed enormously, especially in the last 100 years. But it begins with travel, with all those boats, and the way that that opens up connections all over the place. Expansion of literacy that began in Europe and is now at the point where the UN says that 84% of the world's adults are literate in one degree or another. We passed the 50% literacy level somewhere around World War II. So it's only been since then that more than half of the world is literate. It's really quite recent from an astrophysicist point of view, from a cultural history point of view. Increase in the speed of communications. Well, we all experience that today. And probably most of the people in this room can remember back to the point where, you know, yeah, you had fast telephone conversations, but a lot of other things moved a fair bit slower. We've moved beyond just language. It's multi-sense at this point. Visual. We haven't quite gotten to smell, but anyway. And a huge increase in person-to-person access. And I want to illustrate this with cell phone subscriptions. Now, here's the curve of increase from, this is 1990. This is a much smaller time frame here than we've been looking at. 1990, 2000, 2010. And you're probably not at all surprised to see that that curve has shot up in that way in that space of time. But I haven't given you the scale over here yet. This is percent of world population. And in 2011, it was 86% of the world population. Now, there's a caveat I have to put in here. That doesn't mean that 86% of the world's population had cell phones, because of the way cell phone subscriptions get counted. But the World Bank says that in 2012, 75% of humanity had access to a cell phone, either through a family member or a friend. And most of these cell phones are just what are called feature phones. They're relatively simple cell phones. However, 20% of humanity 15 years or older had smartphones at the beginning of this year, that's a little over 1 billion people having smartphones. And another 1 billion smartphones are expected to be sold this year. And for the first time, they're selling more smartphones than they are feature phones. Now, you may have your feelings about whether or not you like or don't like smartphones or whatever. But from a cultural history point of view, putting that degree of communications access into the hands of so many people and allowing communication that is person to person rather than all done through broadcast is a huge system changer. So, from my point of view, just as the Empire era needed literacy to come into full form, my sense is that the Planetary era needs these new electronic tools as well. And that's why we're just, it's still birthing. All right, well, let me come back to this now. And I want to focus in on the way that over the last 500 years, more people have gotten more choice in their lives. And it's hard to think back to how little choice a peasant had in 1000 CE or whatever. But if you look at choice of occupation, place of employment, political leaders, friends, associates, marriage partners, where to live, information sources, beliefs, goods and services, etc. Now, I know not everybody in the world has that. The level of choice is not necessarily what it could be. I'm not saying this is perfect. What I'm saying is that these things have increased dramatically in the past 500 years. And I would also say that choice destroys the power of coercion. Because if you have a meaningful choice, coercion depends upon having people trapped. And if you can vote with your feet, if you can simply walk away from the situation that would attempt to coerce you, then that coercion has a lot less power. So there have been two responses to this way in which there's now more choice. One of the responses has been a shift to indirect, covert, psychological methods of control. Which, we've moved, let me step back and say, in the Empire period, the elites were primarily military and religious, combinations of those two. We're now in a time period where the Empire consciousness moved into the commercial realm. And the present elites are primarily commercial elites who are a little more accustomed to using things like advertising and public relations and things of that sort. But this is basically a system that doesn't have integrity. And it depends strongly on being able to control the flow of information, because if people get the total picture, it blows the game. So it's actually a fairly vulnerable position to be in. The other thing that's happened in response to more and more choice has been a growth of all kinds of self-organized consensual collaboration. And that's everything from people choosing who they're going to marry, to special interest groups that these days happen on all sorts of different scales, to businesses that form where people come together with the intention to form a business, to communities like what you all are involved in and study. And to me, this is analogous with nature's approach to organizing complexity. In natural systems, you have coevolution and symbiosis, coevolution being this sort of dance of collaboration. And my sense is that because the second one really is reflected in the way that nature deals with it, that it's the one that has more staying power. So I'm going to say that What we're seeing in the planetary era so far is a move towards self-organizing consensual collaboration as the basis for social organization. We're still in the transition. I'm not saying that's all there is. All right. Well, I'd like to close this history period, or at least this backward look in history, with just getting this. I just love this population chart. I think it tells us so much. And to emphasize, at least to me, when I look at all this, we are in a truly different world right now. Being with a full Earth, communication so tight that we really have a small world, it is unlike the full gamut of that previous history in so many ways. And yet we think we're still just in, it's just another century. Okay, so now let's look forward. And again, look at how we're going to think about the future. Well, for one thing, I think we need to acknowledge that the Empire era is still very strong in our minds. It shapes our language and our beliefs. Almost all of that has its roots in the Empire era. And that includes our ideas about human nature and simply how life works. And because we're in a different world in terms of our daily life, but our minds are still in the past, this leads to all kinds of cognitive dissonance and attempts to interpret what's going on around us in the old terms that lead to all sorts of frustrating misunderstandings. For all of us. The other thing about the future is to know that there will be surprises. Truth is stranger than fiction. Some things will turn out better than we expect, some things worse. I like to say that it's easy to see the disasters that are headed down the road. What we don't see yet are the things that are yet to come up over the horizon, some of which will actually be beneficial. For example, it wouldn't surprise me at all if in the next 10 years, for example, we got an invention like nanotechnology-based water desalination that made water desalination cheap enough that you could do it for agriculture, which would have a huge impact on where food could be grown, how much food could be grown. And I just cite that as the kind of thing that we may have all kinds of positive things come up over the horizon as well as the more challenging things. And of course, some things will just be totally unexpected. I'd like to hope, though, that as long as we take these system domains and transitions into account, at least the big picture, near term, is potentially discernible. So that's what I'm going to try to do next. To look at, so where might we be going with the planetary era? And in the process of stepping into that, I want to acknowledge that I started all this saying, hey, we've got this big change that's happened. We're moved into full Earth and we've crossed over the carrying capacity. And yet, as I was trying to discern what the characteristics had been so far, that was over the last 500 years. So does this new transition invalidate what we've been seeing so far? And I think no. I think actually the limits to growth crisis is going to simply enhance and accelerate the trends that we've seen so far. It's going to spur yet more innovation, and I don't mean just technologically. I think that the real constraints today are in social considerations, how people live with each other, the kinds of things that communities actually deal with best are the places where we have the deepest limits. And I certainly expect that successful innovations will use the succession species strategies. So that means there will be high levels of diversity, high levels of symbiosis, which I translate into human terms in terms of self-organizing consensual collaboration. Communications will be prioritized. I think one of the messages out of that high level of cell phone subscriptions is that people who don't have running water and flush toilets nevertheless feel it's important enough to be able to get that communication access that they have prioritized something of that sort. And I think that'll continue to be the case. But sustainability needs to be added as a fourth defining characteristic. Because unless we manage sustainability, we're still in a chaotic transition. So particularly because of this need to transition to sustainability, and because we're moving from this rapid population growth to something where we're leveling off and then even going down, every facet of culture is likely to be affected in the near term. Economics, governance, legal systems, healthcare, education, religion, warfare. I want to particularly comment on warfare and say that the long-term trends are that warfare is in fact winding down. And my sense is that within 2 generations, we will have ended warfare as an institution. And when we end warfare as an institution, we will really know we've moved out of the empire era. But I think we're that close. And if you think about, yes. If you think about the way in which it's been with us for 5,000 years, another 2 generations is not that long. This is not a time to flag. This is a time to redouble the efforts to move us to being able to do that transition. And it's not simply because it's morally the right thing to do. It also has huge system support. With our tight levels of both economic and communications integration, and the need to become much more efficient, we will finally be able to acknowledge that warfare is enormously wasteful. It no longer is as economically valuable as it was in the Empire period, and it just will lose its support. Right now, it really doesn't even have that kind of system support and is running purely on the momentum from the past. And my sense is that as new generations come along, they will not be convinced of its value. That said, I also want to acknowledge that a lot of these changes are going to be resisted. After all, the empire, I mean, this is a sort of crude way to put it, but the empire era was built on bullying. And the bullies are not going to be enthused about losing their place. And of course, their mode of operation, when they get stressed, is to try to bully. And from as far as I'm concerned, I see this showing up in the behavior of all kinds of different fundamentalisms. To me, it's not a matter of religious this or political that or whatever. It's actually people who have been raised in empire-era traditions, feel that that is the right thing. They draw on their interpretation of their religious traditions to justify why all of that empire stuff needs to continue, and they go for it. But they're on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of the system support. But agriculture and some level of command and control hierarchy, not coerced command and control hierarchy, but if there's a fire, I want the fire chief to be directing what the other people do. And they probably do too. So that and literacy, certainly, they're not going away. They're just going to become secondary, just the way it worked in the previous transition. Okay, so planetary era characteristics as I see them at this point. Characterized by sustainability, diversity, not just in occupations, but in lots of ways, self-organization, which will seem chaotic to our minds, but it's the way nature does it. Connectivity, huge connectivity. And one of the key things is that it will be at ease with innovation. It will be at ease with learning. It will not be afraid of discovering new things. And when we get to the point of being not afraid of discovering new things, surprisingly enough, we will have moved into a new stability. We will have moved into a new stable domain. And human relationships at all scales will be fundamentally consensual. So for me, the central issue of our times is not whether humanity or the Earth will survive. We very likely will. We could lose 90% of the human population and be back at a point that we were in about 1700. You know? I'm not inviting that. I'm just saying. We'll likely find our way through this crisis and in so doing complete the transition. I think that the limits to growth crisis is the final piece in the transition to the planetary era. For me, the issue is how graceful can the transition be? How much suffering can be avoided? How much long-term damage can be prevented? So I'm not trying to say to you, hey, it's all okay, you can go on vacation, it's over. No, this is the time to really redouble the effort. Because what we do over the next few decades will have a huge impact on how much suffering there is, how much long-term damage occurs. Humanity will get there, but I like to say we're being called to be cultural midwives. There is a birth that is happening, and just as in a birth you have a full spectrum from the possibility of a stillborn baby and a dead mother to something that is really beautiful and ecstatic. And a good midwife can make a difference in terms of where you fall along that spectrum. So there's a birth that's underway, and what we do will make a real difference in terms of how much suffering and how much long-term damage. So what we each do matters in that sense. And I want to acknowledge that it's taken just countless courageous choices by millions of people in hundreds of generations to get us to where we are at this point. And it's going to take countless more. But if we're aligned with those succession species strategies, we will have a path to success. And with today's communications, learning and innovation processes have accelerated enormously, so that if we build good cultural DNA, we can spread it quickly. So what do we need to do? First of all, we need to recognize that we are in this great transition and let go of the empire era. It's still very strong in our minds. Find a way to honor it, bless it for its gifts, but let it go. And then step forward into the planetary era. And really be, in an ironic way, we need to be pioneers of what it means to be a succession species. And do it all with compassion. All of us are torn inside between what we grew up with and the reality that we have to deal with around us. And as we see others who are freaking out because they're torn by those things, I think it's important for us to approach it with compassion. To me, that is the planetary era way to do it. If we see ourselves as fighting the empire era, we're still in the empire era. It's only when we say, it's done at some level, and I can meet you with compassion, that we really have stepped into the planetary era. And then the action step: innovate, implement, educate. What is going to drive this forward is all of the good social innovations that will come from places like the communities that you're all involved with. And unless we work on those, if we're focused backward on saying, no, we don't like this that's going on, or no, we don't like that that's going on, we won't change the system. Bucky Fuller used to say that the only way that you change something is to make it obsolete. And the only way that you make it obsolete is to come up with a better way of doing things, which is what innovation is all about. So why am I so encouraged? I hope you get some sense of it by now. As I see, the momentum of history is moving towards a cultural system domain that's based on sustainability, diversity, self-organization, and connectivity. And I'll acknowledge I like those things. I'm happy to be moving in that direction. And I like the feeling of having the winds of history at my back as I do this. Even though we're moving through turbulent times right now, the larger momentum is moving with us. The obstacles we face are human, cultural, and solvable. It's not as if there was an asteroid approaching us and there was nothing we could do about it. This is all of our own making and of our own remaking. Even individuals and small groups can have a big impact through the innovate, implement, educate, if they're aligned with planetary era qualities, because that's what it takes to be successful as we move forward. And I see people all over the planet who are rising to the challenge and seizing the opportunity of this time. So it's not as if it's just the people in this room by any means. There are just, millions of people out there who are doing wonderful things that are moving us forward. All of that I find hugely encouraging. Okay, implications for communities. And we're going to have a week to get into this part. So I'm going to be relatively brief, and I want to acknowledge that the things that I'm going to describe here are things that many communities have been doing for decades. And I hope you will take this as an appreciative acknowledgement of the foresight of what those communities have been doing. First thing is that so many of the innovations that need to happen as cultural innovations are really best worked on in the human scale communities. So there's this wonderful opportunity to work on the stuff that really needs to be worked on, to build the cultural DNA that we need. And those innovative communities, they get to enjoy the benefits of living in this new culture sooner. And as someone who both goes away and comes back to a place like Findhorn, I get to the pleasure of experiencing the culture that's here and being nourished by the culture that's here. These communities can also serve as sources of hope and experience, not just hope, but grounded experience for the wider world by being centers of research, demonstration, and training. I think that communities that are focused on creating their own private salvation for themselves, with the idea that the world is going to hell and they're going to be the only points left and all of this, I think they're in for trouble, frankly. I think that the communities who truly serve are the communities who see themselves as connected to the wider process and are willing to be the human research, demonstration, and training points. So, related to this, my suggestions for communities: examine your own images of the past and future. Look at places that you're stuck in Empire-era thinking, or in reaction to it, which is another form of stuck in it. Expect the pace of change to be even greater than what we've had. And for those of you who may not know hockey, this is kind of a hockey expression here. Skate to where the puck will be. The idea is anticipate where things are going. Don't just look backward and react to what has happened, but anticipate those changes so that what you're doing can meet them when you're ready to get there. Work with the flow of history. Lead towards the emergence of the planetary era by aligning yourself with those planetary era qualities, and innovate, implement, educate. There's something, if you have an inspiration for something that you feel would be a positive change, go ahead, please innovate with that. If you see some positive changes, that some idea that somebody's had, or they've done a little bit of it, but you feel you could get it functioning better, you can do the development part. Well, that's what I mean by implement. And then once you've got things that are working well, get it out to a wider public. There's something that everybody can do along this innovate, implement, educate spectrum. So, thank you. So I want to acknowledge that I'm sorry I did take a long time. But then I was covering 16,000 years of history, so.
Thank you, Robert. That was a wonderful journey. In your suggestions for communities, I'm involved in communities for 20 years, and at the same time I'm aware that cities today cover 4% of the surface of the planet and consume 85% of the natural resources. And I just read on Saturday New York Times saying that the latest planning for China is moving 250 million people to cities. Mm-hmm. This is big, what's happening in terms of cities. How can we, in eco-villages and communities, as centers for innovation and education, can really have an impact in the implementation on the redesign of our urban centers?
Great. Thank you. Great question. And I'll see what I can do with it. And that concern was one of the reasons that I spent 7 years on my local city council, was to try to do some of that bridging. And it's challenging. I also want to point out that one of the reasons that the population curve goes down is because of that movement into cities, that the birth rate for women in urban environments is much less than the birth rate in rural environments. So it's having that effect as well. But I think it's important to recognize that in communities, intentional communities, don't have a monopoly on all opportunities for interesting innovations. So I think drawing on the community's strengths, the places where you integrate together the social, the various decision-making forms, the food production, the energy production, the way that I know this community has worked on lowering its ecological footprint in human scale terms, is one piece in a larger puzzle. And that piece will be most effective when the people who are doing that work are cognizant that they're doing it not simply for themselves, but also for people in neighborhoods and cities, people who also have their human scale qualities, even if they're in something that we may look at as huge. So how do we bring what we're doing into not just co-housing developments, but row house places that are neighborhoods? How does some of that impact there? There are also ways in which the both more human-oriented and the more inner attunement-oriented decision-making processes that Findhorn has worked with could be very valuable in an enormous number of business settings. And I know that there's been a long stream of business consultants that's come out of Findhorn for just that reason. So I think that the key is to recognize you aren't going to cover the total territory, but if you think about what your connection will be and see yourself not as an isolated island, but as something in service to a larger whole, that you can find that right relationship.
My question is about the curve, the population curve you gave.
Yeah.
And you said it's an S curve, or we can compare it. But I recognize that what you gave later was it's going down again, and we have overshot already from the carrying capacity. How do you see that?
I started with the S curve not as my final landing point, but just as a useful stage along the way in terms of understanding the dynamics. The curves that overshoot and come back down again are more complicated to describe. So I went on a long time. I had to do a lot of triage in terms of how much detail is all that I'm saying. But in terms of the more fundamental, I do think that we have overshot. We have a lot of work to do to be able to bring population level and carrying capacity back into alignment with each other. And that can be both a movement of carrying capacity and a movement of population. But I would be very surprised if there was not movement of population down in the 21st century. And there are graceful ways for that to happen, and there are ugly ways for that to happen. And that's another place where, what we do is going to make a huge difference.
My question concerns a factor that I didn't see in your presentation, which is very much a part of the current transition, and this is climate change. And if my memory serves me right, we actually crossed what is supposed to be the Copenhagen limit, and we are definitely headed toward a 2 degrees change of climate.
Right.
And I've heard climate scientists say that if we go up to 3 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, then we're looking at massive systems breaks down. They can't even simulate what will happen. And this is also seen in the collapse of food chains, in the 6th mass extinction, and we're definitely looking at a number of natural disasters and environmental refugees. So I'm asking you, where is the cause for hope when more likely than not we're looking back into a throwback, back into the tribal period with small human settlements and small pockets of resilience?
So I'll certainly acknowledge that I didn't give particular focus to climate change, because with the immersion that I've had in the limits to growth work for 30 years, climate change is one of the aspects of that. I think there are a lot of questions at this point in terms of, how do I say this? Certainly, as an astrophysicist, I take the atmospheric questions very seriously. But I have to ask myself, what is the most effective way to make changes that will make some difference in the climate? And this is a place where I will again say there are no environmental problems, there are only environmental symptoms of human problems. So climate change is a huge, in-our-face environmental symptom of human problems. And so, to me, that is just yet more motivation for being able to step out of the old structures that at the present time are being hugely ineffective in terms of being able to deal with climate change. Look at how can we come up with new governance systems that are relevant to the 21st century. Most of the governance systems that we have around today were invented 200 or more years ago in a very different world. They have some good qualities to them, but they don't even begin to take into account what we know now much better about human behavior, the communications tools that we have available to us, etc. So this is a matter of a kind of a systems look to try to see, well, where is it that we can intervene to get the quickest results? So I certainly would affirm your sense that we have a serious issue to deal with. And because we have a serious issue, we have to be very thoughtful and strategic about where we intervene. And it's with people.
song, Eco Village in New Zealand, asked, where does money and consumerism fit into the transition, and are local currencies the right direction?
So I want to say diversity is the right direction. Local currencies certainly can have a role to play. Consumerism runs smack into the problems of the limits to growth. The microphone probably didn't like me doing that. And that's where the choices that people have made in so many communities to figure out how to have high quality of life with a lower quality of material throughput, if I can describe it that way, serve as wonderful examples for let me step back and say that in terms of human psychology, if you simply say to people, no, don't do that, it can work a little bit, but it's not the best approach. For a small percentage of the population, if you give them an idea of something else they can do, they'll be early adopters and they'll take it on. But for a large percentage of the population, they won't actually shift until they see somebody else doing it. It's the enormously important role of demonstration. And I think that this is a place where the demonstration of quality of life that communities have been able to provide is a huge gift relative to issues like consumerism.